I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West.
Hey, let's talk about compromise. Nikki, what do you think?
Let's do it. I think this is something that everybody struggles with sometimes, myself included.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that people are, well, I mean, my first thought was ego, which we still haven't done that Freud episode, but I think there's no struggle with it if there's no ego involved.
Yeah, but we all have, but
I have a healthy ego.
Yeah, you do. Well, but ego that you're referring to is a different, it's more actually from like the spiritual kind of language than Freudian
Although
ego.
I said this to my colleague the other day, where he's a psychoanalyst and he's done psychoanalysis, and he was talking about like buying a house or some of this stuff, and it was all like very like showy, and he was like owning his ego in it. I was like, well, what's the point of psychoanalysis? And he was like, and it took him a minute, and then he said, well, it's better than my id reacting.
You're like, fair. Yep, fair. That's totally fair. Yeah, well, no, but I was to say, but ego and compromise, I mean, sure, it could be like your ego gets in the way, but I also think it just comes back to this concept we talk a lot about on here, which is human brains want to be comfortable. Yeah. And so compromise actually means letting go of some discomfort because you're not getting it your way, and nobody likes that,
Nobody does like that. And anyone who's like last born is
Listen for you. I know I'm a firstborn, so.
And I'm a lastborn.
Yeah. So I am used to just
whatever Nikki wanted.
Just bossing my poor brother around.
You weren't that bad.
No, but I do. I have a psychologist colleague who she was saying like being the oldest is like, she's like, I think that's what makes us good psychologists. Cause we're just like used to, it's like, you're used to like leading the way kind of. Like,
although as the youngest, I'm often referred to as Switzerland because I'm keeping the peace.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Well, so maybe you can use that as a jumping off point for maybe how you've cultivated the ability to compromise.
Nothing really matters. That's why. I think sometimes it creates the challenge because I then appear ambivalent. And so what that means for listeners is like sometimes so compromise means that if I want to go to place A and Nikki wants to go to place B, then I'm like disappointed if I don't go to point A because that's where I want to go. I approach this as like, I'll go to point A or point B. Like it doesn't make much of a difference to me. And so sometimes that's then seen as like ambivalent because like as if you don't care. But I just see that as like being super flexible. Because wherever I go, I'm there. And that's like John Kabat-Zinn's.
Wherever you go, there you are. Yeah. Well, I think, okay. So I like that as a starting point because look, to be clear.
Because you want to challenge me.
No, I don't want to challenge. Actually don't. I don't want to challenge. Well, I don't want to challenge you here. No, it's more that like, look, I think it's important to acknowledge sometimes we are ambivalent, right? Like there are times when we like don't care. We don't have a strong like opinion or feeling about any one thing. In those cases, compromise is not required, right? You're like kind of going with the flow. If somebody else has a strong preference for something and you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't really care. Okay, compromise is not a skill that you're going to pull out of your toolbox, right?
No.
Compromise is required when there are two differing preferences or ways of looking at things, and you're trying to come to a middle path and find.
There you go.
Woo! I'm bringing in the Eastern here.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. Come to a middle path that is workable, and we've talked about workability a lot on this podcast. That workability does not mean that it's perfect or optimal or the best. It means that given the context, given the situation, this is most effective. And that also requires tolerating and accepting some discomfort. And I think that's where people get really stuck on compromise is like, they don't want to let go of being comfortable, right? They're like, I want it my way. But that's what, if both people want it their way, you're stuck in space. You can't go anywhere.
So everyone has had a challenge with that. I want this to be a blue room. I want this to be a pink room. I mean, I think all these things require like a conversation. I'm going to keep pushing us with this though, because I do think that this is rigid. I think that if ever, and I know that you're seeing that So the definition of compromise by Oxford, as I love to give us, the agreement, an agreement or a settlement of a dispute that is reached by each side making concessions. Mm-hmm. So the concessions, like that's the piece that people struggle with behaviorally because they're feeling like they're conceding. Mm-hmm. I mean, that the verb to concede.
Well, because they are. That's the truth of it. You are you're giving up something.
Well, is that our perspective though?
How do you mean? Say that again.
Well, because the concession is that my way was right, rather than there's no concession if I'm simply approaching life flexibly.
Okay, yes. I think maybe what we would want to do is like back it up a step further to say everybody thinks their perspective is right. That's that's the baseline functioning of the brain. Like we think that like our way.
I'm stuck there.
Why are you stuck there?
Well, because I mean, maybe I'm just speaking independently. Mm-hmm. I don't think I know anything.
Well, but I think that's but Pete, I think that again comes from like many years of practice. That's many steps down the road that if we go all the way back.
You want me to take a step back? Okay.
Yeah, it's going all the way back. Like at baseline, the brain thinks, like everybody thinks their perspective or way of doing things is right. Like that is just, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective right? It's like, you want to like, what we know and do, like, it would make sense that we'd want to attach to that and try that and move things forward. Otherwise we would, I don't know, we'd never explore, we'd never try new things. Right.
Well,
I mean,
referencing our episode on curiosity recently.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, again, I think it's because of rigid thinking. And we're agreeing on that.
Yeah,
and so what
it is rigid. So it's like that baseline is rigid. Like baseline, human beings are rigid. Like that's our, like, we're not like we always say, like,
it's a universal experience.
It's a universal experience. We're not born mindful. Like mindfulness,
God,
as we said,
why
I know.
Not?
Well, it's, again, because like we always say, like flexibility, mindfulness, like that actually takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy. Again, evolution's trying to be quick here, right? It's got to select for quick and easy things, and rigid thinking is a lot less processing power, right? It's a lot easier to process in binaries than it is in 17 perspectives,
Well, I find it to be more, I guess you speak, but the gray to me is way more fluid.
Well, so again,
my practice got me there.
Your practice got you there. So it's like, I think what I want to
we need the whole world to be here then.
Well, totally. But I think what we want to make sure listeners understand is like what Pete's describing, he didn't come by it naturally.
No, it took a
lot and continues to, right? Like
all the time.
Yeah,
it never ends.
Yes. So compromise is making a concession, because the concession is letting go of I'm right. It's conceding I don't know everything. There isn't one right way to do things.
So I'm putting myself in the shoes of a listener who's like, what are they talking about? And so we got Nikki breaking it down that all of our brains are rigid initially, and that as we've practiced, we've gotten to a place of more flexible functioning. So I want to break it down for some tools. So maybe can you think of ways that you have clinically worked with some folks around compromise, or maybe an example of like somebody who struggled with compromising?
Yeah, well, you're gonna laugh when I say what's the first tool do you think I have in my toolbox that I pull out? Can you guess?
I can.
Go for it.
Wait, mindfulness.
Yes. Yes. So the first step, so depending on the situation or the person, mindfulness is it's like a set of behaviors under this larger umbrella. Like it might be literally like teaching them to medicate. They might need to medicate as well. Meditate. They might need to meditate so that they can learn the practice of paying attention to experiencing the moment. But a lot of times the behavior that we start with is non-judgmental stance, right? Like seeing things as they are, because when people are stuck, when they're willfully refusing to compromise, it's because they're stuck in my perspective is right, as opposed to seeing let's acknowledge the many different vantage points here. Let's take in the data. Which
could limit one's ability to experience something more fully, because there's likely. So I was watching Okay, so can I go on a little bit of a
Go, please
just for a minute?
Yeah, totally, go for it.
So I broke down my like cable so that I would try and save some money, and now I have Hulu, Prime, Netflix, Apple TV, Apple Plus, HBO Max. I mean, it is insane.
You're preaching to the choir.
Okay,
yep,
so there's no easy way to clean this up because there's at least 1 or 2 shows on each of them that I like really like, and so I need them for that. So right. Listeners, can I get an amen? So with Apple TV, there was a show called Home, and I love stuff like this, architectural, and also the first episode was this home in Sweden, and it's called a nature home, Naturhusur, Naturhaus. So, and what they did is they built a greenhouse around the house.
Ooh,
cool. It's so cool. You have to check it out.
Yeah.
And they did a self-sustained like water system in the house. Anyway, now I'm coming to the point, everybody. The municipality didn't want them to have this only because then they wouldn't buy into the municipal water. And there's clear evidence that there's not enough water or that the water was contaminated or whatever it was. And they were able to develop a self-contained water system with both their like sewage, waste, and like, it was so fascinating. And so again, the point there was that the municipality didn't want to accept it because it was outside of the box. It wasn't right. It wasn't what people knew. And it took this architect and this engineer, the builder, to say like, here's the evidence, here are the data. And so by the end of the episode, they say like that he actually won his case, but it took 3 years for him to win his case against municipality. So I know we're not going to talk about some of the global events that occur, but this is where people get stuck on compromise. So I think that's why I'm feeling so stuck on this.
Well,
help me, Dr. Rubin.
No, I don't think you need help. Actually, I think you're doing a beautiful job, actually, illustrating this human problem.
Yeah,
is to become trapped in one vantage point, right? One, like a belief that there's one way to do things, there's one right way to be. And what, that example Pete just gave really highlights is that, again, that gets in the way of something that gets in the way of compromise, number one. And without compromise, it gets in the way of a more workable solution.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's where I think like, this word, we're talking about compromise because obviously that's a word that we use out in the world, but I would say in the therapy room, it's actually not a word I use a lot. The word that I use all the time is workability. Is it
workability?
Workable?
Would you also describe it as a dialectic?
What, compromise? Oh yeah. Absolutely. Like dialect. Yes. Being dialectical, seeing that two opposite things exist at the same time.
And maybe I'll have you talk about dialectical behavioral therapy for a minute. But I'm also wondering, like, what if you think about just universally the biggest issue that people have with compromise? Because the thought that comes to mind for me is like romance, like that's, I feel like, where people need to find compromise the most, because it's like parenting.
Right. If you're in a partnership, right. And totally. Though I would say that again, it extends in anything, right? And I always make the joke, like if Congress was more skilled at this, if they just listened to me and Pete's podcast,
Well, because again, I know that. So like another thought that keeps coming to mind is like abortion or no abortion. It's like, there's such a righteousness around that's it. That's the word. So like when you said like, what is the thing that gets in the way? It's an attachment to being right. Yeah.
And I think like, this is where I would love to hear some of the Buddhist perspective, because this, like, that to me is just like the crux of stuckness, right? Is this attachment to being right.
Yeah. Well, I think the Buddhists, in the Zen way, I've talked numerous times about the middle path, so that there's really no right or wrong. I mean, one of the, like the Diamond Sutra and some of their sutras that we chant, like really just said there's no beginning and there's no end. There's no life and no death. And I think that's where I find all of this like intellectual stuff goes. So I'm always struggling in my Zen practice, being around and being taught by a teacher who's really smart intellectually. Like, again, he's like one of the most read people, if not the most read person I've ever met. I struggle with that because it's like, I don't need more intellect.
Right.
I feel like what we need in Zen is like more emotion,
more practice.
More practice.
Right.
And I think that for me is where this is. So middle path is where they would say it, that there is no right or wrong. So that flexibility is inherent in the meditation practice. Mm-hmm. So I've shared the story of like going to see the Dalai Lama and all of his monks just like letting everyone go in New York, an experience that doesn't happen in New York as you're going into Rockefeller Center. Everyone's like pushing to get to the front of the line.
Right.
Remember those days?
Oh, I do. I remember them well.
Yeah. So that would be the Zen thing. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, and I think what I would love to hear more about, because I know you've also talked about this here, is the attachment piece, because I think that's a big part, like this attachment to being right. And obviously my understanding is that, obviously non-attachment is a big component of Zen Buddhism.
The big S, perhaps.
The big S. Okay. The big S. Yeah. So can you say more about that? Like how those would kind of be related to one another, like the attachment to being right?
So that's the second noble truth, is that our suffering and our pain is caused by attachment. And so it's acknowledging that. So that's why when you do the third noble truth in the Eightfold Path, you're no longer, this is why I'm having such a hard time with this episode, because
I have to say, it doesn't seem that way. It's like maybe internally it feels that way, but I'm following what you're saying.
Well, says one mindful practitioner to the other.
Right.
It's so with the second noble truth, I've already embraced that my attachment is what causes my suffering. So that's why I so easily went through. For anybody on our vlog on YouTube, you may have noticed that there's less on my shelves here. And that was intentional, because part of this practice, as we were been recording this, I was like, this looks so stupid behind me. And it was all books and stuff. And it was like, and then there was like medals. So I donated a lot of the books to like some libraries, and the medals I just threw away, which were like swimming medals from, people have heard about some like swimming career. So it was just like, what do I need all this for? I did actually save just like 5 first place medals.
I was gonna say, I'm glad you saved some of those. I mean, but the proud Jewish mother inside of me is, but like keep them.
Yeah.
Keep them.
Let them. Yeah. Tchotchkes, let them collect us.
Exactly. Reading my mind. Yeah.
But that was like, that's the best example, I think, for listeners about non-attachment, because the truth is those first places, that experience, all of that is within. And so I don't need without or external for that internal validation. And that's a lot of, when I first started teaching, I wanted to know the answers in case a student asked the question. Like, if we're traveling, I want to know where we're going,
Yeah, I mean, as we all do, it's attachment to being right. And it's like, and it's, I think if we bring this back to when we're engaging with another person that is also attached to being right, the practice of non-attachment, and here comes a little bit of a Western behavioral science perspective. It is a behavior, right? Yeah. We practice non-attachment, so it's like, I think when people are really stuck, when they're like, we can't compromise, this is kind of like a common therapy saying, we'll say, well, it's not that you can't, it's that you won't, right? It's not that there isn't an ability. It's that you are not choosing to practice letting go of being right.
Right.
And you're choosing not to practice considering alternative perspectives, and you're choosing not to practice conceding something that you would like to keep around.
Yes.
So, I think that's something that I hope people will keep in mind, that compromises, it's a behavioral practice. It's a practice that is going to be uncomfortable, right? Like, it's like it's not going to be an outcome where you just like feel totally amazing, or it's, you feel all pleasant feelings. And in the long term, it is going to feel better. Like going back to that example in, I'm sorry, was it Sweden or Switzerland?
Yeah, that
Sweden.
house, the greenhouse.
Yeah, that house, that greenhouse.
The nature house.
Yeah, the nature house that, like, while it was kind of a process to get to it, it's like on the whole, that's going to work a lot better.
Yeah.
Right. It's going to actually be a more comfortable experience in the long term than if they had just been, caught in their, like,
well, this tug
fight.
of war,
Yeah.
and that kind of, hopefully for listeners, that also illustrates the dialectic of this, that there are definitely listeners that feel abortion is right or is wrong. We're not here to say that it is. There's other global things like Israel, Palestine. We're not even trying to say what's right or wrong. We're simply saying that it's the rigidity of understanding, the difficulty to get to that compromise. And I think a good way to maybe end already, because I can't believe we're at the end, is to think about a quote from the Dalai Lama around compromise. So dialogue means compromise, respecting each other's rights in the spirit of reconciliation. There is a real solution to conflict and disagreement. There is no 100% winner, no 100% loser. Not that way, but half and half. That is the practical way, the only way. This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.